everyone, and welcome to MGFA's Wellness Series webinar, Managing Chronic Disease. I'm Jenna Umvalo, and I'm the Director of Patient Advocacy and Community Engagement at the MGFA, and I'll be moderating today's session. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. If you have any questions, you can put them in the Q&A chat located at the bottom of the Zoom screen, and we'll answer them during the Q&A segment. I'd like to give special thanks to the support of our Wellness Series sponsors, Alexion, Argenx, Janssen, and UCB. We've got a great presentation ahead, and now it's my pleasure to introduce you to today's presenter, Dr. Anita Chatney. Dr. Chatney is a neuropsychologist who works with patients with chronic diseases, including MG. I'll hand it over to you.
It is my pleasure to be here today. I am a neuropsychologist. I practice out of Palm Springs, California, where it is a balmy 109 degrees today. We are on a cooling trend as it was 120 last week. So I am thrilled to take the opportunity to talk a little bit about navigating the psychological challenges of MG. And I'd like to talk a little bit about the objectives. You can go ahead, Dan. Okay. First of all, I'd like to highlight the psychological challenges facing people who have been diagnosed and common feelings along the way that people have had. I want to talk a little bit about the dynamics of the mind-body relationship as it relates to neurological disease. And I'm hoping that I can finish this presentation with each participant coming away feeling like they have a few more tools to optimize confidence and coping, and specifically tools to manage stress and fatigue. So I think the natural place to begin is the diagnostic journey. And typically what happens is a patient experiences subjective feelings of unrelenting fatigue. This is the loss of energy that can't be recouped by rest or relaxation. Oftentimes, people will experience muscle weakness that results in falling or imbalance, visual changes, or mental fogginess. So what occurs is these are reported to a physician, and these typically are experiences that are internalized and specific to the patient. And oftentimes, the solutions seem like quick fixes. Patients will sometimes be told that they're depressed or unmotivated, or that they're not getting enough exercise, or that they've had difficulty with sleep. And all of these things are the results. The MG symptoms are the result of things that are more superficial. All the while, the patient is going through multiple tests and consultations, leading to a great deal of frustration. The common feelings are a sense that something is happening internally that others cannot see or quantify. And oftentimes, as symptoms advance or frustrations advance, a patient comes away feeling like they have losing control over their body and their life's activities. Frustration is a common feeling associated with that. Oftentimes, patients feel a loss of self-reliance as they're having to ask others to help them when to do things that they normally did without thought. As if symptoms are significant, oftentimes people will question the meaning and purpose of their life. There is a sense of emotional isolation that can come not only from having to excuse oneself from social events, but also the emotional isolation of feeling the internal changes without the observation or the acknowledgement of these changes by others. There are normal feelings that come from neurological disease, and normal meaning within the context of the disease and the sequela of the disease. People can have difficulty with worries of death and dying, of grieving the loss that could have been, or the life that could have been, and the awareness of new priorities being set. Oftentimes with neurological conditions, relationships change. people that we have identified as close support sometimes move to the outer limits of our social life, and others who have been on the periphery now show the capacity to be closer. You can advance, oh, there we go. We need to go the other way. All right. So what happens with the initial process of diagnosis, we make and create two appraisals. The first appraisal is, what am I facing? And the second appraisal is, what do I have to give to that challenge? Next slide, please. So what am I facing? This appraisal is influenced by internet searches. That's where we go to first, generally, when we don't know what it is that we're facing and these 3-4 syllable words that we're reading about. The unfortunate thing about internet searches is that oftentimes it's very difficult to discern credible research, credible information from that which is not so credible. Oftentimes what happens is we might know a loved one or a friend or a coworker that has been diagnosed with the same diagnosis, and we witness their journey and have a tendency to superimpose what we have seen as a struggle in someone else as something that we will begin to face. As I mentioned before, there are normal fears and apprehensions within the context of the diagnosis. And this and how we feel about what we are facing sometimes is also complicated by our own sense of grief and loss and frustration. It feels like we are at the bottom looking up. The second appraisal is influenced by competing stresses. So if I have a family, a job, work pressures, I don't have time to care for myself. And that's going to impede my appraisal of what do I have to give to the challenge. If I have a history of anxiety or depression, or if I have long had rather passive approaches to my own problem solving or issues of low self-esteem, I'm going to feel like I am facing this challenge with very few abilities to be able to meet it eye to eye. We also assess our environmental resources, family support, the support of an employer, insurance companies, or insurance coverage around recommended care. And lastly, the ability to appraise what do I have to give to the challenge is also impacted by the severity of symptoms, because it's very, very hard to feel like we have the energy to feel good if we don't feel good physically. So getting back to appraisal number one, what am I facing? Oftentimes we sense that we are facing Mount Everest. So I want to give a couple of guidelines for this, because these two appraisals don't just happen at the beginning of diagnosis. They happen throughout the course of treatment. Once we find changes or evolving information about our medical status, we're constantly going back to what am I facing and what do I have to give to the challenge. So in the first appraisal, the first concrete guideline that I would offer is get all the facts and face this appraisal with an academic hat. We need to know that our journey will not be like any other's journey, and that we will have our own story to write around the disease and around the sequela of the disease. We need to take Mount Everest in chunks. And in order to do this, we have to put blinders on. And these blinders will change. Sometimes if I'm feeling like I have a little bit of energy and I feel like have a little bit of emotional fortitude, I'm going to be able to open up the blinders a little bit wider. But if I have enough energy to maybe make it out of bed and take my medication, then those blinders of Mount Everest are going to be more narrow. I want to avoid the success failure judgment. I've succeeded because I've conquered the disease for the day, or I failed because the symptoms of the disease have gotten the best of me. I want to instead create a situation where I'm facing Mount Everest eye to eye. I'm giving MG the respect that it deserves as a medical entity, but I am not letting it define who I am as a person. So in order to do this, I need to believe in myself, and I need to do my homework to create a medical team that I can collaborate with and that I feel trust with. Okay. So some concrete guidelines for boosting emotional resources. We have to, again, put on that academic hat. We have to be very clear and honest about our own psychological strengths and weaknesses. Oftentimes, this is very difficult for patients to do because sometimes we believe that a psychological weakness means failure. And we all have strengths and weaknesses. We all have abilities and inabilities when it comes to our coping dynamic. So we need to get a realistic appraisal of what can we rely on in terms of our personal strengths for meeting the challenge of Mount Everest, and what is it that we want to be able to pay less attention to in this journey. We want to identify the barriers and the challenges as we begin the journey of coping with neurological disease. We want to create realistic plans for improving the psychosocial challenges. So knowing in detail what our insurance covers or doesn't cover, knowing and getting a good handle on where our employer is going to be supportive and where they may not be so supportive. We need to know what is our support system like. Now, one of the things I will tell you in my experience as a neuropsychologist is that oftentimes support systems and families will be very, very strong, but the patient becomes reluctant to rely on the support that is present. They are reluctant to ask for the help. Now, I want to digress a bit, and I want to talk about this because one of the most vulnerable and difficult positions to be in is to be a spouse or significant other to a patient with MG, witnessing their struggle and not being able to take it away. And so sometimes rolling the sleeves up and washing the floor or doing something in a tangible way to be able to contribute back to the coping allows somebody to feel partnership with their loved one. And so the message to every patient that is listening today is allow others to help you, because by allowing others to help you, you are helping them. And lastly, the goal of boosting personal resources is to create a partnership with body. It's not about conquering, it's about partnership. Because an example of that is if you know your best friend, and if your body is your best friend, you know when to push, you know when to back off. You know what helps, you know what hurts the relationship. So we're going to talk a little bit more about this partnership and how we go about achieving that. So symptom management is a key component to effective coping. And today we're going to go over in more detail symptom management as it relates to stress, fatigue, and cognitive and emotional changes. And the place to start is to talk a little bit about the mind-body connection. I've been a neuropsychologist for 35 years. And 35 years ago in the medical community, there was this notion that if a medical entity occurred, it either occurred in your body or it occurred in your head, but it could not occur in both places simultaneously. And so we have come a long way in terms of our understanding and medical evolution So what we know is what affects the body has direct impact on our mental health. And also what occurs with us emotionally has repercussions for the management of illness. And I'd like to use this diagram as a way to illustrate that. It starts with a perceived threat. And the threat can be something that we witness. It can be something that occurs with us, or it can be something that we think about. So what happens is when we identify a threat, immediately there are nerve signals that signal the hypothalamus and the pituitary gland to produce cortisol, which is a stress hormone. The cortisol is released into the body and central nervous system reactivity occurs. So what does that mean? It signals the heart to beat faster. It signals blood pressure changes, a rapid respiration. The immune system is stimulated and the body begins to turn sugar and fat into energy. Some refer to this as the fight-flight response, but we do not necessarily have to be in extreme levels of stress in order to experience this. All we need as a trigger is that idea of perceived threat. Now, once these physiological changes occur and we are aware of the changes that are occurring in our body, then we say, uh-oh, uh-oh. And while we are saying, uh-oh, another perceived threat, and the cycle then becomes a repetition of itself. And physiological changes can mount and actually exacerbate the expression of any kind of chronic disease. So when it comes to MG, emotional or physiological or physical stress uses up energy that can make symptoms or symptom expression worse. So let's talk a little bit about what stress is. We used to think that stress is horrible, awful things that happen to people or chronic, unrelenting pressure. We do not define stress like that necessarily. We define stress as rising to the call to meet challenge. So anytime you deal with driving a crowded freeway, anytime you deal with trying to be to a doctor's on time, or planned events, holidays, tax time. And so there are events in our life that produce the same reaction, maybe not to an extreme as a accident, a car accident, or death or dying, but stress can be from things that we do in our daily routines. So there are two types of stress, and the first type is external stress. These are things that fall into our laps without notice and sometimes can be seen in advance. The second type of stress is a little trickier to diagnose and treat. This is internal stress, and it comes from the expectations that we carry for ourselves and others, the shoulds of our life. He should be a better driver. We shouldn't have to pay this bill. I should be able to do this because I was able to do it last week. So the shoulds of our life dictate how much we rise to the call. So for example, if I say to myself, I should be all things to all people at all times, that assumption of me creates a high bar. And if my body will not respond like my spirit and my willingness to, it creates an internal turmoil that can lead to frustration and high levels of energy expenditure that come from my thinking. So I wanted to give some concrete tools to be able to manage each source of stress. And the first point that I want to talk about is set point. And what this is is the awareness of what your body feels like when it's in a relaxed state. Not when it's in a state of fatigue, but when it is in a relaxed, calming state. So sometimes we have to draw upon memories. We draw upon the memory when we were sitting on a porch, on a swing, or when we were fishing by the lake, or when we were in Hawaii on the beach. But what we do is we call upon those images and we examine how our bodies felt. What did my neck feel like? What did my shoulders feel like? What did my forehead feel like? And we get a mental appraisal of what the body feels like in its relaxed state. Now, our goal is to be able to manage our lives with reference to where we are now in relationship to that set point. So when it comes to external stress, the things that fall in our laps, the things that we don't really have a lot of control over, if we can see and plan for the stress that we are going to engage in, we need to create proactive planning. So for example, if I have to drive a crowded freeway, I want to take my favorite music with me and listen to my favorite music, in addition to being able to be vigilant enough to stay safe on the road. I might have a doctor's appointment once I travel on this crowded freeway, and I might need to take 2 or 3 hours to be able to relax, have lunch, so I'm not rushed to get to that doctor's appointment. So time management is important when it comes to external stress, giving myself extra time rather than to rush through to get to the destination. Exit strategies are important. One of the things that I notice about patients is we like to make commitments to others that allow us to engage. But every commitment sometimes becomes stress if our body and the dynamics of the disease sometimes say not today. And so what happens is we need to have exit strategies that come with, I'm going to make a commitment, I'm going to share this with my friend, and I'm going to make allowances that say, if I need to modify this commitment, please let me do that, okay? The other exit strategy is if I'm going to a wedding and I love Aunt Bertha, but I can tolerate Aunt Bertha for about a 30-minute period of time, I'm going to need to make a strategy so that when Aunt Bertha is on the table that I'm sitting at, that I can relate or create another conversation with someone. I can maybe move to another table to socialize for a brief period of time. I can develop conversation about the weather. So I'm not necessarily in a captive situation, feeling my emotional thermometer going up. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the thermometer. An emotional thermometer is a tool that we can use as we go through our daily routines. We encounter stress and that thermometer rises. Most of us in our lives are taught grin and bear it, move through it, ignore things. And what happens is when that emotional thermometer gets halfway up the scale, if we don't do something and we allow it to move to the top, that becomes an emotional expenditure of energy. And so we are constantly creating this balance. So when the emotional thermometer gets halfway up the scale, that's the time to turn the channel on the TV set. It's a time to get up and get a drink of water. It's the time that we interject something that we are doing at that time to get the thermometer back down to below the halfway point. So we're constantly working on this emotional thermometer to make sure that it doesn't rise above the halfway point. Now, internal stress is a little bit trickier. Again, we are working with that set point. And as we see ourselves creating commitments, developing multitasking effort to manage the multiple demands of our life, what happens is that we sometimes create unrealistic expectations of ourselves, and we need to create sometimes a time that we can witness ourselves pulling back or modifying. So what we need to do with internal stress is, rather than create a bar of expectation, we have to create an understanding of our strengths and our weaknesses, and create a very fluid, dynamic strategy for living life, so that we know what our capacity, and we are going to work to our capacity, but we are going to modify the plan given the partnership of our body and what it is that our body needs for that particular moment. We need to examine and redirect what we refer to as our self-talk, the judgments that we create for ourselves when we can't meet our own expectations. Oftentimes, what I hear from patients is, what is my purpose? What is the meaning of my life? I often hear people who say, you know, I can drive down the street and I can see all of the projects as an architect or a builder that I have done. I can see the handiwork of my strength. And now I don't have that strength. So what's my purpose? And I want to reinforce my mantra that I give to patients, and that is, the importance of a person's life is in who they are. The importance of a person's life is in who they are, not necessarily what they can do or not do. And in talking with loved ones over the years, without question, they are in agreement. The importance of a patient's life is in who they are. Now I want to talk a little bit about fatigue management, because I know that this is a critical area of symptom management for everybody diagnosed with MG. And I want to give you the analogy of a checkbook. What happens is, if we have a checking account and we have money in the account and we're living on a fixed income, we know that once or twice a month, money is deposited in this checkbook, and we need to create expenditures to keep ourselves above zero balance. If we go below zero balance, that money, we're going into deficit spending, and we're making up for it the next month, or maybe 2 or 3 months down the road. And with fatigue and myasthenia gravis, what we're talking about is an energy checkbook. And the amount in the checkbook will fluctuate daily. And it fluctuates according to the disease, of course, and the advancement of the disease, but it also is influenced by things like sleep, nutrition, medication, and also the level of activity the previous day. All activity requires an expenditure of energy, the ability to speak, to eat, to dress, to think, cognitive expenditure of energy. And what happens typically is we reach a zero balance. And sometimes we can reach a zero balance multiple times during the day, and then we take a nap or we rest. And sometimes we can pull it above the zero balance, and then we move to a zero balance again. But what we need to do in this partnership with our body is we need to know when that zero balance has occurred. Because typically what happens is a person gets up and they say, you know, I feel pretty good today. I've got to do the laundry. I've got to get some gas in the car. I've got to go grocery shopping. And we have a laundry list. And somewhere along the line in that laundry list, we reach zero balance before our list is completed. And naturally and normally, we are taught, ignore the symptom and get the job done. That's what we are taught as human beings. So sometimes we push ourselves beyond that zero balance. We're driving the deficit spending. Then we spend the afternoon, the next day, and maybe 2 or 3 days in bed. Then we get up and we say, well, gee, we have a little bit more energy. still haven't finished my list. And now I have more things on the list to do. So I repeat the same pattern again, drive it. And pretty soon I'm living a pattern of perpetual frustration around the loss of energy. So let's talk a little bit about the environment. I want to talk to you a little bit about, these are tools that occupational therapists often present to patients with neurological diseases. We know that bending, stooping, and lifting requires more of an expenditure of energy. If a person sits, that's less expenditure of energy than if they stand. Oftentimes people stand in showers, and sometimes that takes more energy than sitting. Oftentimes the effort to consolidate action can create energy conservation. So I'll give you an example. If I decide that I want to set the table and I have 4-piece settings, and I go to the kitchen and I bring out one setting, and then I go back to the kitchen and I bring out another setting, I've made 4 or 5 trips to the kitchen to set the table. That's an expenditure of energy. Whereas if I had a cart, I have all of the things from the kitchen, put everything on the cart, move it out to the table, put everything on the table, and I just conserve some energy. When I have household tools between my shoulders and my hips, I am conserving energy because it's less time with my hands above my head or bending over at the waist. That helps conserve energy. And the use of assistive devices, and I want to kind of delve into this a bit more. Oftentimes people are resistant to the use of assistive devices that have to do with walking and ambulation. So I see individuals who will say, I will walk, but I will not use a walker. I will go to X, Y, and Z, but I will not use a wheelchair. And what we know is that when adamant decisions are made not to use assistive devices, it brings our world into a smaller sphere. And if I could use an assistive device and allow myself to participate in activities within the community that allowed me to conserve my energy, I'm going to have a fuller quality of life than if I adamantly refuse to use those assistive devices. And the last is extreme temperatures of heat and cold can influence the expenditure of energy. So one thing I want to talk a little bit about is cognitive changes that can occur. Now, there are typically 2 types of cognitive changes that can occur. And the first is transient. These are typically cognitive changes that come when the brain doesn't have enough energy to function in that moment. So think about a pilot light. If the pilot light is burning too dimly, I don't have the mental acuity to create effort to think, to read, to absorb information. Typically, these transient cognitive changes are associated with things like medication, fatigue, sleeplessness, and nutritional changes. So when we look at cognition, cognition has to do not with intelligence, it has to do with the brain's efficiency. So what we want to look at is how do we make the brain more efficient when we are addressing cognitive changes? Well, certainly, if we could do some energy conservation, that would help a bit. It would open up the pilot light a bit. But the other thing that we want to think about is the efficiency begins with the effort to sustain attention and concentrate. So if the mental acuity is limited, I'm not going to have the energy to sustain attention and concentration. And everything that is built upon that as a building block to everything else, like memory and judgment and everything else, is going to be impacted by the loss of attention and concentration. So if the cognitive changes are transient, meaning they come and go, the concrete advice that I would offer is to focus on the effort to register the information. Because if information can be registered with a cognitive transient issue, if it can get registered with attention and concentration, the likelihood is the brain is going to recall information. So things that help with this are a memory logbook. So memory logbooks can be as simple as ledger pieces of ledger paper in a notebook where we're writing things down as we need to remember them. Or it can be a daily planner where we put down phone numbers and people that we've encountered. But when I write things down, I'm employing what I've heard, my kinetic effort, my visual effort to lock in the information and sustain attention and concentration. Once it's locked in, then I have a tool, a concrete tool where I can see something, and that will trigger the retrieval of the information. Cell phone apps are a great tool to be able to remember things like medication times, appointments, and that such. And mindfulness. Mindfulness is the effort to be engaged as you are engaging. And an example of that would be, is if I'm in a rush to get to an appointment and I go through my house and I'm turning off the lights, and I get down the road and I say to myself, did I turn off that light? Well, that's an example of needing some mindfulness. So if I am slowly approaching the effort to turn off the light, my eyes are looking at the light switch. I am saying to myself, I am turning off this light, and I look and I'm engaging in the effort to lock in that information. That's mindfulness. If we have, again, the ability to go slowly and to work at locking in the information, it gives our brains better opportunity for retrieval. And if we are engaging in cognitive tasks, we really want to devote morning hours for the tasks that are most challenging. So things like paying the bills, reviewing in legal documents, those types of things should be done in the morning hours when our mental acuity and our energy is probably the greatest of the day. Now, progressive cognitive changes are a little different. They can come from chronic influences like cardiovascular issues, hypertension, cholesterol, or they can come from rapidly advancing issues that come from other medical entities or what we refer to as medical comorbidities. It can come from metabolic issues, cardiovascular issues, pulmonary issues. In this case, what happens is that generally we find a point where the brain our cognitive skills begin to weaken, and there typically is not a let up. When the energy comes back, the cognitive problems continue. In this case, you really want to alert the physician to what might be going on. You want to manage the underlying medical condition that may be connected to it. And you want to approach the compensation or the treatment of this as not a one-size-fits-all kind of approach, but it will be very individualized to the nature and the severity of the deficit that the patient has. Now let's talk a little bit about emotional changes. And as I mentioned before, neurological disease and emotional expenditure have a mind-body relationship. So we need to manage emotional changes as we would any other kind of physiological entity. And oftentimes, people are not likely to report depression or anxiety to their physicians. They feel comfortable in talking about things like, bowel movements or changes in the ambulation, but not necessarily changes in the emotional state. So we need, again, to put on that academic hat, and we need to know our own psychology. What helps boost us? What are the triggers for good moods? And what are the triggers for weakened emotional states? finding a community of support like this one is imperative, because I will tell you, oftentimes clinicians can imagine, we can imagine what a person with MG feels, but we don't know. The only people that know are people that are going through the same process. We need to consistently search for meaning and purpose. And typically what happens is when we are diagnosed, we focus in on what we've lost. And what happens is as symptoms become unmanageable or they become overwhelming, we have a scope of activity that we see ourselves once having enjoyed. And what we have when we appraise our abilities is a sense of our scope being very, very, very narrow. But what happens is with adequate symptom management, we can move that sphere or that scope a little bit wider, but we don't know what we can achieve until we begin to work in that realm. But oftentimes we appraise our lives with that small scope and we grind it in concrete emotionally. And what happens is that creates depression, anxiety, our sense of inadequacy to meet the challenge. So what we want to do is we want to, again, create that partnership, look at this scope as a pursuit of possibility. So the pursuit of possibility comes with, how can I adapt what I know to be able to better work for me? What can I do rather than what can't I do? Most patients know what they can't do, but many more are at a loss to know what they can do. We need to devote mental energy within the areas that can be managed and or controlled, and less attention on the defeat. That's easy for me to say. It's very difficult and challenging to engage in that process, but it is a necessary process to pursue. And when we get frustrated, we need to use that as a signal to ourselves that it's time to reset our thinking patterns. So rather than be frustrated and then shut down because we're frustrated, we need to use that as a signal. So if I have a cold and I sneeze, that's the signal that something's happening internally. If I have frustration, I need to see that as my signal to reset. So in summary, we know that profound levels of fatigue can be experienced with individuals with the diagnosis of MG, and that patients and family members alike have emotional and cognitive challenges that can emerge. In summary, it's important to remember that the body does not know the difference between the emotional and the physical expenditure of energy. It all comes from the same pot. And the psychological adjustment is a dynamic process. What am I facing? Leveled out with what do I have to give to the challenge? The emphasis is creating an I experience with the disease. And lastly, symptom management is a vital aspect to gaining confidence in coping. So I want to thank you for your time and your attention, and I'm happy to field questions as they arise.
Thank you so much. We do have some questions, so we'll kick them right off. The first one is, what type of coping mechanism can we use to reduce external and internal stressors?
Well, the external stressors are really things that we can see, and we have to do two things. We have to create a proactive approach, which is usually going to be something that has to do with action. So knowing that an event that's coming down the road, knowing what kind of stresses are going to be there, and creating an action plan so that we can veer around the things that we identify coming at us. And that can be something as tangible as driving a crowded freeway, or it can be as intangible as meeting Aunt Bertha at a wedding. Now, internal stress is a little trickier because we have to identify our self-talk. What are we saying to ourselves that are creating the bar or the shoulds that we have for ourselves or for others? And we have to change that self-talk. So I might say, I need to be all things to all people at all times. Well, changing that self-talk might be, I need to be the best that I can be in the moment that I have, and I need to work with my body to be the best in what my body will allow me to be in that moment. So if the self-talk becomes pervasive and my own effort to redirect the self-talk is not working so well, this is sometimes when support groups or counseling experiences with a medical psychologist might come in helpful.
Great. Thank you. This next question is, for the person with MG that doesn't have a caregiver or care partner or family in the area, where does that person begin to form a community of support?
Okay, well, the first place is the virtual community of support. The next is oftentimes support can come from agencies in the area, and the way to know about those is from your physician offices. So for example, if you're living alone, a lot of times agencies in the community might have senior centers or might have other places that in our county, we have what we call in-home support services that are run through the county Office of Aging that will actually allow people to come in and help with food preparation and that type of thing. So I think the main thing is to research Office of Aging, research through your physician offices. Oftentimes, local hospitals have social work departments that have lists of community support services that can be accessed. And again, the issue is, for many people, is what is covered by insurances and what is not covered by insurances. And do I have the financial resources, or I do not have the financial resources? But I will say that there are a lot of foundations that are developed for people that don't have a lot of financial resources, but it does take more investigation.
Thank you. What is the difference between a neuropsychologist and a regular psychologist?
Great question. Okay. A neuropsychologist is actually someone that is trained and licensed as a psychologist, but we are also trained in neurology. And so our background is understanding brain function and understanding diseases, neurological diseases, and how they affect psychological processes.
Great. And the next question is, how do I get referred to a neuropsychologist?
That's a great question. There are not a lot of neuropsychologists in the country. One way to access a neuropsychologist is if you have a relationship with a neurologist. The neurologists are very familiar with neuropsychologists in the community. If you want to do a national search, the National Academy of Neuropsychology and the American Psychological Association typically have people that are licensed through those agencies, and they can give you referrals to people who might be in your community. But the physician is the place to start. Mm-hmm.
Okay, that's great. What if a caregiver doesn't understand how much I'm capable of doing on my own? They do too much for the person with MG, and the person with MG feels a loss of independence.
Yes, this is a great question. This is a dilemma that I see all the time. Sometimes the doing too much can be an expression of fear and an expression of incredible love. And sometimes couples need to chat. Usually I would recommend when they chat when there's not a lot of tension in the air, but they chat when the environment is a good environment, and they create a blueprint for helping. So a blueprint is going to be different for every couple, but a blueprint might look like something like, let me try it 3 times. And if I can't put my socks on by the 3rd time, then I want you to come in and help me. That would be a blueprint for helping. Or it might be, when you see me struggling, tell me, but stay close, but give me the opportunity to stand on my own. So you're creating kind of a cooperative relationship, and the loved one is saying, listen, I see you doing X, Y, and Z, and that scares me to death. And you don't know how dangerous it is to do X, Y, and Z. So that's why I'm jumping in. And that the loved one is perfectly within their right to say that as well. So again, it's a cooperative plan that comes from the mutual understanding of different perspectives.
Thank you.
Mhm.
This next one is, as a caregiver, how can I help the patient overcome something like a refusal to use a walker?
Another great question. Here's my analogy. Sometimes the walkers are necessary to avoid falls, okay? And sometimes the walkers are assistive devices that allow us to engage in activities that we wouldn't otherwise be able to engage with in. The analogy that I use is, if you build a block wall and I have 1 trowel, can that brick wall be built? Yes. Is it cumbersome? Yes. Does it take a lot of time and struggle? Yes. Now, if I had 6 tools to build the same block wall, it would be built quicker, more efficiently, and it would probably look better. So the issue is, if a person refuses, it's usually related, if they need it and they're not using it, it's usually related to a sense of self-reliance. That person is grasping for their sense of self-reliance. And we need to create other areas aside from the use of the walker that will allow that person to feel that self-reliance. So the walker doesn't become yet one more symbol that I've lost something.
Okay, this next question is, the prednisone I take for the MG has caused my blood sugar level to triple.
Yep.
And resulted in canceling my knee replacement. How does one deal with the resulting stress and depression in light of the fact that I can't go off the prednisone?
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a loss, right? And first of all, it's a great question for a physician, because sometimes it's not either or. Sometimes there are workarounds when it comes. Definitely, you need the prednisone, and you need to take the prednisone. It sounds like that's not an option of change, right? But the other option is for physicians during surgery to be able to see if there are workarounds to that. And oftentimes it requires the neurologist to speak to the orthopedic surgeon and to be able to create a plan of action. So I think that this is a great question. I would not give up to think that this is it, but I would speak with the physician to see if you can create greater collaboration between the 2 clinicians.
Thank you. This next one is brain fog real in MG? My neurologist says it's not related.
Aha. Okay. Well, brain fog is something that is a descriptive term, okay? And oftentimes physicians don't delve into descriptive terms. But I think if you ask people with MG if they've had brain fog, they would say absolutely. Okay, so what happens is brain fog is really loss of mental acuity. It feels like we're thinking through a paper bag. It feels like we're moving through sludge. And it's really about not having enough mental acuity and enough energy to be able to process swiftly. So oftentimes, with an example of brain fog would be if I'm in conversation and I'm hearing the words, but my interpretation of the words is about 2 or 3 seconds delayed from what I would normally do. It's because the firing is slower And it's not like the voluntary change or voluntary muscle impairment that we have with MG. It's really about fatigue. Yeah. And I think the great example that I would give to anybody, including medical personnel, is that if you've ever worked on a project for 24 hours and then you get up and you're trying to do something that requires a lot of mental effort, your brain is in a fog. You can't do it. And so that's what we refer to as the same process of brain fog. It's not necessarily a neurological entity, but it's a descriptive term to describe the efficiency or lack of efficiency of the brain.
Got it. Okay, we have one more about fatigue. Since fatigue is a problem that happens frequently, are you suggesting resting, sleeping, napping as needed? Sometimes I lose an entire day.
Right, right. Well, I think it's all about balance. Okay. So sometimes we spend too much time in bed and we can lose muscle efficiency just by spending too much time in bed. So there is a balance, right? And I would say rest, scheduled rest breaks on our own terms, small scheduled rest breaks can put a little bit more energy into that checkbook. But I would venture to say to practice the energy checkbook conservation and try not to drive the system to see what the system is like. Because a lot of times we create an appraisal of what MG is doing to our energy stores as a concrete ground and stone appraisal. But what we might be looking at is the fact that each time we get up and try something, we're driving the system into deficit spending each time. So I would start off by trying to work this energy checkbook, see where the zero balance occurs, and a 15-minute off your feet kind of effort might be enough to, on your own terms, to schedule to be able to get that checkbook back to zero balance or above.
That's great. Thank you. Well, this concludes our Q&A segment, and I wanted to thank everybody for the wonderful questions that they asked. And I want to thank you, Dr. Chatney, for a wonderful presentation. I definitely was taking notes, so some good tools that I can translate into my own life as well. Thank you all very much and enjoy the rest of your day.
It's my pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.